There's an article in the Financial Times this evening by Robert Shrimpsley, and it argues that Nigel Farage's proposals of mass deportations, leaving the ECHR, rolling back human rights laws, have shifted into the mainstream. And the implication is that politicians, and by extension the public, must take these ideas seriously because they are supposedly the centre ground of debate. That is precisely the same sleight of hand that carried Brexit from fringe hobby horse to national rupture. But it deserves careful unpicking. Democracy is about reflection, representation and deliberation. Populism is about volume, speed and the crowd, and maybe the occasional fist. The fact that a slogan or a policy is shouted loudly, endlessly retweeted and endlessly repeated on talk radio doesn't make it democratic. It merely makes it noisy. A cacophony is not a consensus. And the article confuses the ubiquity of the language of mass deportations with legitimacy. But as with any marketplace of ideas, the loudest stallholder is not necessarily selling the best produce, the best wares. The point of democratic institutions is to filter, test and weigh claims, not to act as amplifiers for whoever shouts loudest. Calling something mainstream is a rhetorical trick. It suggests inevitability, that there is no alternative. And I'm afraid at the moment there isn't much of an alternative, but mainstream is not measured by decibels or flag waving. It's measured by whether a policy can command broad reasoned consent and whether it can withstand scrutiny in law, economics and morality. On each of these grounds, Farage's agenda collapse. Legally, leaving the ECHR undermines binding treaties, destabilises devolution, and risks shredding Britain's international standing. Economically, mass deportations would be exorbitantly costly, bureaucratically impossible, and devastating to key industries reliant on migrant workers. And morally, demonising entire groups of people degrades social trust, encourages violence, and betrays the very values that Britain has claimed to champion since 1945. Shrimpsley cites polling and tells pollsters immigration is their top concern. So the argument is that Farage is articulating the mainstream views, but polling reflects mood, not mandate, and asks people about control or too many migrants and you capture anxiety. Ask them if they want their local hospital, care home or construction site without migrant staff and you get a different picture. Polls take the temperature, they do not supply the treatment. The article rightly notes that the sudden proliferation of flags is a sign of insecurity, not confidence, yet it then misreads insecurity as a reason to follow the populist lead. In fact, insecurity should be met with reassurance, fact and policy competence. To indulge it is to inflame it. The lesson of Brexit was precisely that following populist anxieties down the rabbit hole does not solve them, it multiplies them. Ordinary people are indeed being cowed into silence, but not because they agree with Farage, rather because disagreement is drowned out by volume. Teachers, clergy, even moderate politicians hesitate to speak, lest they be branded anti-Brexit, anti-British or soft. This chilling effect is itself proof that we are dealing with populism, not democracy. A genuine mainstream view doesn't need to intimidate dissent into silence. Shrimpsley invokes Brexit as a cautionary tale. Liberals misread the nation, therefore we must not misread it again. But Brexit is not a precedent for capitulating to loudness. It is the very evidence of why capitulation produces bad government. The fact that the nation was persuaded once into a self-wounding choice is not a reason to indulge the same playbook again. It is a reason to resist it. And the article concludes that Labour must neutralise immigration by adopting elements of Farage's policy. That is appeasement, not politics. To neutralise is not to mimic. Otherwise the so-called centre is constantly dragged towards the extremes. The lesson of democracy is that leadership sometimes requires persuasion, not surrender. Leadership can and must be about moving opinion, not just echoing it. Shrimpsley is wrong for three reasons. He mistakes noise for content and for consent. He mistakes polling anxiety for a political programme, for some sort of sense. He mistakes the lessons of Brexit, thinking don't ignore means don't resist. To call Farage's agenda mainstream is to capitulate to populist framing. It is the political equivalent of saying that because everyone in a football crowd is chanting abuse, the referee must award a penalty. Democracy is the ability to withstand noise. Populism is the demand to mistake noise for wisdom, or to be intimidated by that noise. Farage has raised the volume. Populism began, particularly in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the populares. The what's the FT called? The Financial Times has mistaken noise for a symphony, but it is still the same tune, simple, destructive, and wrong. It's a noise, and the task of politics is not to amplify that noise, but to insist, calmly and firmly, that being loud is not the same as being right.